My own daughter shoved me down a flight of concrete stairs and walked away. As I lay in the dark with a shattered hip, her husband looked down from the landing and told her to let me die down there. But before I lost consciousness, I pulled a phone from my pocket and made one single call. What happened next completely erased their existence. I am Eugene Hartley, 65 years old, and this is the story of how I destroyed the monsters I allowed into my home. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along, so you never miss what comes next. Before we go any further, I'd love to know, what are you up to right now while you're listening, driving somewhere, cooking dinner, or just resting at the end of a long day? Drop it in the comments. Now, a quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. The bold letters on the front read, Pinewood Manor Care Center. I didn't need to open the envelope to know what it was. A state-funded low-income facility for the destitute. A place where forgotten people went to wait for the end. I looked at my 28-year-old daughter. She had on the sapphire pendant necklace I bought her for her college graduation. Her arms were crossed, her eyes fixed on me, utterly empty of warmth. She told me it was time to face reality. She said I was too old to be managing the house on my own, and that my slight limp from a previous knee surgery was a liability. She demanded I sign the deed of my 4-bedroom home over to her and her husband Garrett. They needed the equity to expand their lifestyle. I reminded her that I owned this house outright. I reminded her that I had let them move in rent-free 2 years ago, so Garrett could pour himself into his failing tech startup. I had handed them the master bedroom. I had moved myself into the guest room. I covered the property taxes, I covered the groceries, I covered every utility bill. I asked her how she could stand in my own hallway and tell me I was the one who had to go. Garrett appeared from the kitchen doorway. He was holding a glass of orange juice I had squeezed. He looked at me with a smirk that made my blood run cold. He said I had until the end of the week to sign the transfer papers, or he would stuff my belongings into garbage bags and dump them on the front lawn. He told me I was legally just a tenant, and he'd change the locks while I was out. A wave of absolute disgust rose through me. I understood then that I was not dealing with family. I was negotiating with parasites. I dropped the laundry basket. I told them both to collect their things immediately. The free ride was finished, and they had until midnight to vacate my property. I reached past Natasha to grab the landline off the hallway table. I was going to call the police and have them removed. Natasha panicked, her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. She didn't merely block my arm. She planted both palms flat against my chest and shoved me with everything she had. My heel caught the lip of the top step. Gravity took over in an instant. I fell backward into the dark stairwell. My shoulders struck the hard wooden edge of the 3rd step. I tumbled out of control. I felt my ribs give way as I slammed into the railing. I hit the solid concrete at the bottom with a sickening impact. The pain arrived immediately, blinding and total. A sharp burning agony detonated through my right hip. I heard the bone shatter. The air was driven completely from my lungs. I lay on the freezing concrete, staring up at that rectangle of light at the top of the stairs. Movement was impossible. Every attempt to shift my weight sent shock waves of nausea crashing through me. I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue on the way down. Through the ringing in my ears, footsteps approached the edge of the landing. I forced my eyes open. Natasha and Garrett were peering down at me. Natasha had her hand pressed over her mouth. She looked frightened, but not for my sake. She was frightened by what she had just done. Garrett didn't look frightened at all. He looked annoyed. I tried to call out for help. What came out was a ragged wheeze. Garrett placed his hand on the doorknob. He looked down at me in the dark and said something I will carry until the day I die. He said, maybe now he will get the message, let him die down there. He pulled the door shut. The basement was swallowed by absolute blackness. I heard the deadbolt slide home with a heavy click. A moment later, the muffled sound of their car engine starting in the driveway reached me. They were leaving for their weekend anniversary trip, a luxury resort in Hilton Head Island, a getaway I had paid for as a gift 3 months ago. They were driving away and leaving me in the dark with a shattered hip, fully expecting me to bleed out or die of dehydration before they came back on Sunday. The silence of that basement was heavy and oppressive. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional pain was a different kind of agony altogether. I lay on the cold concrete and let the truth of my situation settle over me. I did not scream for help. There was no one who would hear it. My house's thick walls swallowed every sound. Screaming would only burn through what little energy I had left. I closed my eyes and concentrated on my breathing. I had to detach my mind from the physical wreckage of my body. In that dark, freezing basement, Eugene the father ceased to exist. The man who had sat up through the night, rocking a sick baby, was gone. The man who had written check after check to cover Garrett's business failures was gone. The father who had made excuse after excuse for his daughter's selfishness was dead on the concrete floor. In his place, something cold and calculating stirred awake. Sorrow was gone. The impulse to cry was gone. In their place was a profound, icy clarity. I saw my entire relationship with my daughter for what it truly was, a transaction. I had been an automatic teller machine. When the machine stopped dispensing cash and refused to surrender the vault, they had tried to destroy it. I was not going to let them destroy me. I was going to dismantle their lives with surgical precision. I understood exactly how fragile their world was, because I was the only pillar holding it up. Garrett believed he was a brilliant entrepreneur. He believed he had secured millions in venture capital for his tech startup. He had no idea that the anonymous holding company bankrolling his dreams was entirely under my control. I had funneled my own retirement savings into his business through a proxy to spare his pride. That agreement carried severe morality clauses. A single signature from me could freeze every asset he held. I forced my left hand into my trouser pocket. Every millimeter of movement felt like broken glass grinding through my hip. Sweat ran down my face in the freezing air. 3 agonizing minutes passed before I managed to pull out my emergency cell phone. I gripped it hard. I did not dial emergency services first. If I called the police right now, they would charge Natasha with simple assault. Garrett would retain a lawyer using the startup funds I had supplied. They'd make bail. They'd fight me in court. They'd insist it was an accident. I wanted them to lose everything. I wanted total financial and social annihilation for both of them. I unlocked the phone and dialed a private number. It rang twice. Leonard Morrow answered. Leonard had been my corporate attorney for 30 years, a ruthless, brilliant man who had helped me construct and sell my logistics empire. He knew every secret I held. He knew the architecture of the holding company in full. I spoke slowly, forcing each word out through the pain. I told him to execute Protocol Omega. Leonard went completely silent for 2 seconds. Protocol Omega was a contingency plan we had drafted years before. It meant I was under serious threat and required the immediate unilateral transfer of all my assets into an impenetrable trust. It meant triggering the destruction clauses on every conditional investment, including Garrett's company. Leonard asked where I was and what had happened. I told him I was locked in my own basement with a broken hip and that my daughter had put me there. I told him to lock down the accounts, transfer the deed of the house to the commercial trust, and then send an ambulance to my address. I ended the call and let the phone drop onto the concrete. The trap was set. The machinery of their destruction was already in motion. All I had to do now was survive the night. 30 minutes later, the silence was torn apart by the sound of heavy boots on my front porch. I heard the loud, commanding voices of paramedics. I heard the crack and splinter of wood as they broke the front door open. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. The deadbolt on the basement door was smashed apart. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness and blinded me. 2 paramedics came rushing down the stairs, radios crackling. They knelt beside me, reading my injuries, shouting medical jargon back and forth. They carefully stabilized my neck and began setting up a backboard. A police officer descended the stairs, sweeping his flashlight across the room. He studied the locked door, then looked down at me. He asked me directly what had happened and who had locked that door. I looked up at the officer. My hip was screaming. My vision was going soft at the edges. I knew that a single word from me would send squad cars to run Natasha and Garrett down on the highway. But that was not the plan. The plan required them to believe they had won. The plan demanded they walk back into the house believing they owned the world. I drew a careful breath and lied. I told the officer I had tripped in the dark while hauling laundry. I said the door must have swung shut on its own and the old lock jammed. The officer looked skeptical, but he put it in his notebook. The paramedics transferred me to the stretcher. The pain drove me under for a few seconds. When my eyes opened again, they were sliding me into the back of the ambulance. The cold night air met my face. I turned to look back at my house. The front door was shattered and hanging open. The house was empty. Natasha and Garrett were drinking champagne in Hilton Head Island, toasting to my end. They had no idea that while they raised their glasses, I had already erased everything they thought they were going to inherit. I shut my eyes as the ambulance sirens began to wail, ready to prosecute the next phase of the war from a hospital bed. I floated up from the deep chemical sleep of anesthesia. The transition felt like breaking through thick ice into a freezing reality. The harsh fluorescent lights of the recovery room burned through my eyelids. A steady beeping tracked my pulse. I tried to adjust my position, and a searing bolt of agony tore through my right side. My hip was wrapped in heavy bandages and radiating a dull, throbbing heat. The surgeon had spent 4 grueling hours rebuilding my shattered bone with surgical steel rods and heavy medical pins. I was pinned to that hospital bed, temporarily crippled, yet my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I studied the digital clock mounted on the pale green wall. Tuesday morning. 2 days had passed since my daughter planted her hands on my chest and shoved me. 2 days since Natasha and Garrett locked that door and drove away. They were still in Hilton Head Island, sipping expensive wine on my money, with no idea whatsoever that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way entirely. A hard knock interrupted my thoughts. The door swung open, and a man in a rumpled navy suit stepped into the room. He had a thick manila folder tucked under his left arm and a steaming paper cup in his right hand. He flashed a silver badge on his leather belt. He introduced himself as Detective Canfield from the local precinct. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and watchful. He dragged a plastic chair to my bedside and sat down without wasting any breath on hollow condolences. He opened the folder and produced the incident report the responding officers had filed. He fixed me with a cold, deliberate gaze. He told me the paramedics had needed a heavy steel battering ram to destroy my front door. He said they found me unconscious at the foot of the basement stairs with a severe compound fracture. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and laid out the single most glaring inconsistency in the entire report. The basement door had been deadbolted from the hallway side. Detective Canfield asked me how a grown man goes to the basement to do laundry and somehow throws a heavy deadbolt behind himself from the outside. He watched my face carefully for any flicker of panic or deception. He noted that the responding officer had found my large house completely empty. He asked precisely where my daughter and son-in-law had been during the incident. He was fishing for the truth. He suspected elder abuse. His instincts were dead accurate. If I gave him what actually happened on that landing, he'd have a felony arrest warrant issued before lunch. Natasha would be pulled out of her luxury resort in handcuffs. But a simple assault charge was not sufficient for what I had in mind. The system would offer her a lenient plea deal. Garrett would use the startup funds I had quietly provided to retain a sharp defense attorney. They would portray me as a confused old man whose memory couldn't be trusted and walk away with next to nothing for punishment. I needed them feeling utterly untouchable, so they would stride directly into the financial guillotine I had so carefully assembled. I arranged my face into an expression of deep embarrassment. I let a slight tremor enter my voice, slipping into the persona of a frail, forgetful senior whose best days were behind him. I looked down at my pale hands lying on the blanket and exhaled a long, unsteady sigh. I told Detective Canfield I had simply been getting clumsier with age. I explained that the house was old and the basement door had a faulty, unpredictable latch that had been giving me trouble for years. I said I had propped the door open to manage the laundry basket, but a strong draft from somewhere must have driven it shut. I claimed the impact caused the heavy deadbolt to kick into place on its own, sealing me inside the stairwell. I said, I panicked in the blackness, caught my own feet, and went down the steep wooden steps head first. It was a humiliating story. It made me sound incompetent and dangerously fragile. Every word tasted like bitter ash, but I delivered the performance without a crack. Detective Canfield did not appear remotely convinced. He tapped his metal pen against the edge of the manila folder in a slow, measured rhythm. He told me the forensic evidence showed the deadbolt was fully and firmly engaged, the kind of engagement that almost always requires a deliberate human hand. He asked me one final time whether anyone else had been present in that house with me that afternoon. He offered a lifeline police protection if I was frightened of anyone in my own family. I held his gaze and slowly shook my head. I told him Natasha and Garrett had left for an anniversary trip, well before I ever went near the laundry. I said it was entirely my own stupid mistake and asked him specifically not to disturb my daughter while she was away. The detective watched me for a long, wordless moment. He understood I was not going to hand him the statement he needed to move forward. Without a cooperating victim, The law tied his hands. He snapped the folder shut, a single sharp, frustrated crack. He rose, drew a clean white business card from his jacket pocket, and set it on the tray table beside my bed. He told me to ring his direct line the moment my recollection of the event happened to sharpen. He turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. I took his card and tucked it beneath my pillow. The false baseline was now officially in place. The police inquiry was neutralized for the time being. Natasha and Garrett would roll back home on Sunday, certain they had gotten away with attempted murder. They would assume I was too broken, too frightened to speak the truth aloud. Their colossal arrogance would become the instrument of their own destruction. My attorney was already deep into the asset transfers, cinching the trusts shut one by one. The trap was fully armed and waiting in the dark. All that remained was to let the rats find their way home. The door clicked shut and left me entirely alone in the antiseptic silence of the hospital room. The heart monitor kept its quiet metronomic count. I lay staring at the white ceiling. The narcotic painkillers were working to drag my thoughts back under, but I refused to let them. I could not afford a dulled mind. Every throb of pain pulsing from my surgically repaired hip was a sharp reminder of the mission at hand. I was not simply a victim mending in a hospital bed. I was an architect finalizing a demolition. My thoughts settled on Garrett. I could see his smug face peering down at me in that dark basement. Garrett believed with absolute sincerity that he was a titan of industry. He moved through my house in tailored Italian suits, drinking my expensive bourbon, barking into his phone about synergy and market disruption. He was convinced he was a self-made millionaire on the edge of reshaping the world with his software company. The depth of the man's delusion was staggering. Garrett was not a genius. He was a parasite in a silk tie. 3 years back, Garrett was drowning in debt. His first two ventures had collapsed completely under the weight of his own arrogance and incompetence. He had burned through every dollar he had saved. He had secretly emptied my daughter's college fund, the same fund I had generously transferred to her when she married him. They were standing at the edge of total bankruptcy. Natasha had come to me one late night, weeping in the kitchen. She begged me to rescue them. She pleaded for me to invest in Garrett's new tech startup, insisting it was his last real shot at proving himself. I had just closed the sale of my commercial logistics empire. I had more liquid capital than I could exhaust in 3 lifetimes, but I understood that simply handing Garrett a check would crush whatever sliver of pride he had left, and he would despise me for it. I wanted to protect my daughter's marriage. I wanted to give them real footing to stand on. So I made the greatest mistake of my life. I chose to help them in absolute secrecy. I summoned Leonard Morrow to my private study. We spent 3 days building a completely untraceable financial apparatus. We created a shadow entity called Apex Meridian Ventures. It was an anonymous holding company registered offshore, buried beneath layers of impenetrable corporate privacy law. On paper, it looked like a ruthless elite venture capital firm. In reality, it was simply me at my mahogany desk, funding my arrogant son-in-law out of my own retirement savings. Apex Meridian Ventures formally approached Garrett with an investment offer. We injected $3 million in seed capital into his struggling software company. I will never forget the afternoon Garrett came charging into my living room, brandishing the term sheet in my face. The man was practically vibrating with self-satisfaction. He boasted that a major institutional investor had recognized his singular brilliance. He told me that traditional businessmen like me couldn't begin to grasp the modern digital economy. I smiled, offered my congratulations, and poured him a glass of my best whiskey. I let him believe he was royalty. With that $3 million, Garrett and Natasha transformed into a different species of creature entirely. They leased luxury vehicles and lined them up in my driveway. They filled my closets with designer clothing. They began taking extravagant holidays to Europe and the Caribbean. And while they burned through my hidden money without a second thought, their contempt for me compounded every single day. They moved into my house under the pretense of cutting living expenses, claiming they needed to funnel their personal income back into the business. They claimed the master suite. They relegated me to the small guest room at the end of the hall. They began treating me like an inconvenient housemate, and before long, like a despised servant. They lost all memory of the fact that I was the one covering the property taxes and the grocery bills. My very existence had become an irritant to their glamorous sense of themselves. But I was no foolish old man. I had not assembled a large logistics empire by writing blank checks on blind faith. I was a pragmatic businessman who understood human nature at its darkest edges. When Leonard Morrow drafted the venture capital agreement for Apex Meridian Ventures, I insisted on embedding a very specific legal mechanism within it. Buried deep inside 70 pages of dense corporate language was an ironclad morality and ethical conduct clause. That clause was a financial guillotine, pure and simple. It stipulated that if the company's founder engaged in any illegal activity, demonstrated severe moral turpitude, or was implicated in elder abuse, Apex Meridian Ventures held the unilateral right to freeze all operating accounts without notice. Beyond that, the clause granted the holding company immediate authority to seize all company assets, intellectual property, and personal collateral tied to the business. Garrett never read the contract with any real attention. He was too dazzled by the $3 million figure at the top of the page. He eagerly signed his own death warrant 3 years ago, with no idea whatsoever that his father-in-law was the one holding the pen. When I lay bleeding on the freezing concrete of my basement floor and told Leonard Morrow to execute protocol, Omega, I released that guillotine's blade. At this precise moment, while Garrett was likely stretched out beside a resort pool in Hilton Head Island, a team of forensic accountants and aggressive corporate attorneys were methodically dismantling his entire existence. His business bank accounts were currently sitting at absolute zero. His corporate credit cards were dead plastic. The servers running his software were being seized under legal authority. He was a completely ruined man. He simply had not yet opened his email. I looked up at the digital clock on the hospital wall. It was nearly noon. Their anniversary trip was due to end today. The luxury resort would have attempted to charge his corporate card for the final bill. The card would decline. He would try another. That one too would fail. Panic would take hold. They would race back to the city bewildered and frightened by the sudden implosion of their finances. And then they would think of the old man they had locked in the basement. They would come to the hospital. They needed me now more than they ever had. They needed my house. They needed me to sign the property deed over to them so they could sell it quickly and cover the sudden, inexplicable vanishing of their wealth. They would walk through that hospital door behind flawless masks of deep concern. Natasha would take my hand and manufacture tears. Garrett would position himself in the corner as the steady, supportive husband. They would arrive with the low-income nursing home transfer papers in hand, prepared to extract my signature through sheer intimidation. I repositioned myself against the stiff hospital pillows. I drew a slow breath, pushing past the sharp protest from my ribs. I was entirely ready for them. I had spent my whole life constructing businesses, but this was going to be my crowning masterpiece. I was going to look at my daughter squarely in the eyes, smile with grace, and give her precisely what she was asking for, knowing it would pull her headlong into a hell of her own construction. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open with a bang. Natasha swept into the room, gasping as though she had sprinted the entire length of the building. Garrett followed a half-step behind. They were both still dressed in their expensive resort clothes from Hilton Head Island. Natasha had a designer silk scarf looped around her neck and her cheeks were flushed. She immediately threw herself across my bed, pressing her face into my shoulder and breaking into loud theatrical sobs. She called my name, wailing about how terrified she had been the moment the hospital rang. Garrett settled at the foot of the bed, resting a hand on her back and composing his features into a mask of grave, solemn concern. A young floor nurse had trailed them into the room with a clipboard. She watched my daughter with complete sympathy. The nurse gently touched Natasha on the arm and murmured that I was going to be fine, that the surgery had gone well. Natasha lifted her face to the nurse's tears running down her immaculately made-up cheeks. She thanked the nurse at length, inhabiting the role of the devoted, devastated daughter with flawless conviction. She spoke of how deeply they loved me and how they had left their trip the absolute instant word reached them. I lay perfectly motionless against those stiff pillows. I endured the nauseating pressure of her body against my shattered hip. I said nothing. I simply watched the performance unfold, completely fascinated by the sheer magnitude of her sociopathic lying. The nurse checked my intravenous drip, gave us a warm smile, and withdrew quietly from the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The click of the latch hung in the silence. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The very second the door clicked shut, Natasha stopped crying. She pushed herself off my chest, dried the manufactured tears from her face, and smoothed the creases from her expensive silk blouse. The expression of deep concern vanished from Garrett's face, replaced at once by cold, calculating irritation. He glanced at his heavy gold watch, folded his arms, and settled his weight against the cinderblock wall. The loving family illusion dissolved, leaving only the two parasites I had been foolish enough to welcome into my home. Natasha pulled a sleek leather folder from her designer handbag and dropped it onto my tray table. It landed with a flat, deliberate thud. She opened it to a stack of legal documents and the same glossy brochure for Pinewood Manor Care Center that had launched this entire nightmare 2 days ago. She produced a silver pen from her purse and set it pointedly beside the papers. She did not ask how the surgery had gone. She did not inquire about my pain level. She looked directly into my eyes with a gaze as cold as the bottom of a well. She told me that the doctors had confirmed I would require months of physical therapy and round-the-clock care. She stated that neither she nor Garrett had the time or the desire to serve as my nurses. She pressed one perfectly manicured fingernail against the top document. It was a voluntary transfer of medical and financial power, of attorney bundled with admission papers for the low-income state facility, and beneath it all, a quitclaim deed surrendering my 4-bedroom home to her outright. I looked at the papers. Then I looked back at her. I asked her what on earth made her believe I would ever sign my life over to the people who left me to die on a concrete floor. Garrett let out a short, cruel laugh from his corner of the room. He crossed to the side of my bed and looked down at me with undisguised contempt. He told me I no longer had a choice in the matter. He said they had already spoken to the police downstairs. He flashed a wicked, triumphant smile and thanked me for lying to the detective. He said my story about tripping in the dark and locking myself in the basement was the finest gift I could have ever handed them. Natasha leaned in until her face was inches from mine. I caught the smell of expensive wine on her breath. Her voice dropped to a vicious serpentine whisper. She told me that if I refused to sign these papers right now of my own accord, she would go straight to a judge. She said she intended to use my own police statement against me as proof that I was suffering from severe dementia and cognitive decline. She threatened to have me declared legally incompetent and a danger to myself. She promised that if she had to pursue emergency conservatorship through the courts, she would not be putting me in Pinewood Manor Care Center. She promised she would locate the most underfunded, wretched psychiatric ward in the entire state and seal me inside a padded room where no one would ever hear from me again. She lifted the silver pen and pressed it into my right hand. She wrapped my fingers around the cold metal barrel. She told me to stop being stubborn and accept my new reality. She said I had lived a full life, but my time had passed, and it was now their turn to enjoy my wealth. She ordered me to sign the documents and be grateful they were even troubling themselves to manage my transition. This was the precise moment I had been engineering. I needed them to believe they had shattered my spirit completely. I needed them swollen with a false sense of total victory. I let my hand begin to tremble violently. I let my breathing turn rapid and shallow, simulating the collapse of a panic attack. I darted my eyes between the two of them, projecting pure uncut terror. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced a single pathetic tear down my cheek. I whispered that they couldn't do this to me. I begged them in a frail, broken voice to please just let me go home. Garrett sneered with contempt. He seized the back of my hospital bed and gave it a sharp shake, sending a white-hot flare of agony through my hip. He told me to shut up and sign the papers before they left me to rot in this bed. I kept my hand shaking. I lowered the tip of the silver pen slowly to the signature line of the first document. I lingered there, letting out a soft, defeated sob. Natasha tapped the paper with sharp impatience. I pressed the pen down and signed my name. I moved to the next page and signed again. I signed away my medical rights. I signed the admission forms for the miserable nursing facility. I signed the quitclaim deed to my beautiful house. I signed every page they set before me, taking care to make my handwriting look weak and unsteady. When the final signature was done, the pen slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered to the floor. I let my head drop back against the pillow and closed my eyes, performing the posture of a man who had just surrendered his entire soul. Natasha snatched the documents from the tray table in one swift motion. She scrutinized every signature with an expression of pure, greedy ecstasy spreading across her face. She slid the papers back into her leather folder and snapped it shut. She glanced at Garrett and gave a single nod. The transaction was complete. They had stripped everything they wanted from me. Natasha did not offer one word of comfort. She did not say goodbye. She turned her back on me and moved briskly toward the door. Garrett fell in behind her, pausing only to glance back at me a final time. He gave me a mocking salute, flashed that arrogant smile of his, and stepped out into the hallway. The heavy wooden door swung closed, and silence reclaimed the room. I opened my eyes. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. Every trace of the terrified, pathetic expression drained from my face. I reached under the hospital pillow and drew out the burner phone I had concealed there. The papers I had just signed were entirely without legal standing, completely void. They were void because 12 hours earlier, my attorney Leonard Morrow had already transferred all of my assets, including the house, into an irrevocable commercial trust that I held no direct control over. Beyond that, my medical power of attorney had been legally reassigned to Leonard Morrow earlier that same morning. Natasha and Garrett believed they were walking out of this hospital as millionaires. They thought they owned my home. They assumed they now controlled my medical fate. In reality, they were leaving with a folder of worthless paper, heading back to a house they no longer owned, sustained by a company that had already been legally seized. I dialed Leonard Morrow's number. The illusion was finished. It was time for the midnight escape. The digital clock on the wall read 11:45. The hospital ward was completely still. Nothing but the low hum of the ventilation system and the occasional squeak of rubber soles on the hallway floor. In exactly 8 hours, a transport van from Pinewood Manor Care Center would arrive to collect me. Natasha had booked it for 8 Sarah Lauder in the morning, wanting me disposed of before she and Garrett even stirred to enjoy their stolen house. They believed I was trapped. They believed my will was broken and my assets belonged to them. I lay in the dim light, watching the ceiling, waiting for the cavalry I had already set in motion. At exactly midnight, the heavy door to my room opened with a soft click. It was not a nurse arriving to check my vitals. A tall man, in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, stepped into the room. It was Leonard Morrow. My attorney did not carry himself like a man visiting a sick friend. He moved like an executioner, keeping a scheduled appointment. Behind him came a woman carrying a heavy leather briefcase, and behind her, a man in a crisp white medical uniform. Leonard walked to the side of my bed and looked down at me. His face was entirely unreadable, a mask of pure professional detachment. He offered no hollow condolences about my broken hip. He simply nodded and said it was time to get to work. Leonard introduced the woman as a private notary public. He introduced the man as the head of a private medical transport team, already waiting at the loading dock. Leonard snapped open his briefcase and laid a thick stack of documents on my tray table. These bore no resemblance to the cheap printed forms Natasha had pushed in my face hours earlier. These were ironclad, exhaustively drafted legal instruments built to dismantle my daughter's entire future. Leonard placed a heavy silver fountain pen in my hand. He walked me through the first document. It was a full and immediate revocation of the medical and financial power of attorney I had signed for Natasha. Because I was presently of sound mind in signing before an independent notary, every document Natasha was clutching was rendered null and void on the spot. I gripped the pen firmly. My hand did not shake. This time I signed with slow, deliberate strokes. The notary stamped the page, and my daughter's fate was sealed. Leonard moved to the next document. It was the formal activation of the commercial trust. He explained that from this moment forward, my 4-bedroom house was legally the property of a corporate entity I did not directly manage. Natasha's quitclaim deed was entirely worthless because I had not owned the property to give away. The new corporate owners had already prepared a formal notice to vacate set to be delivered to the house in exactly 48 hours. I signed the transfer papers. The notary stamped them. Then came the final and most devastating instrument of all. Leonard produced the Apex Meridian Ventures executive ledger. He directed my attention to the clause governing Garrett's tech startup. He confirmed that the morality clause had been triggered the moment I called him from the basement. This document now authorized the immediate liquidation of all company assets to recover my initial $3 million investment. My signature on this page would give Leonard the legal authority to drain Garrett's business accounts, seize his servers, and lock him out of his own office building before sunrise. I looked at the signature line. I thought about Garrett telling my daughter to let me die on that concrete floor. I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed the paper. The notary stamped it. The financial guillotine was officially armed and ready to fall. Leonard gathered every document and secured them inside his leather briefcase. He looked at me and said the legal wall was built. Now we had to move me out of the hospital before the morning shift arrived. The medical transport specialist stepped forward. He explained quietly that he had already coordinated my discharge with hospital administration. Because I was legally competent and now under the care of a private physician retained by Leonard, the hospital had no authority to keep me. I was leaving against medical advice which completely bypassed the transfer orders Natasha had put in place. The specialist signaled into the hallway. 2 more medical technicians entered, guiding a high-end specialized transport stretcher into the room. The transfer was an excruciating ordeal. Even with the technicians working in careful, coordinated unison, the moment my body shifted from the hospital bed to the stretcher, white-hot pain tore through my newly rebuilt hip. I locked my jaw and fixed my gaze on the ceiling, refusing to let a sound escape. 2 days on a freezing concrete floor, I had endured that. A 5-minute move across a room wasn't going to break me. They fastened me to the stretcher with thick nylon straps and draped a heavy warm blanket over my body. Leonard stepped out into the hallway ahead of us, clearing the way. The technicians wheeled me out of the room, not toward the main lobby, but silently down a dim corridor toward the service elevators. We rolled past the nurses' station, where the night staff offered nothing more than a quiet nod in my attorney's direction. Wealth and connections level mountains, and Leonard Morrow had spent a lifetime learning exactly how to move both. The elevator doors parted and we dropped into the hospital's basement. There was something fitting about it. My nightmare had begun in a dark basement. My resurrection was starting in one, too. We came out through the loading dock. The night air hit my face cold and carrying the smell of rain on city asphalt. It was the finest thing I had ever breathed. A sleek, unmarked medical transport van sat waiting, rear doors spread open. They loaded me into the back with practiced care. The interior was fitted out like a mobile ICU, blazing with clinical light, every inch packed with equipment. Leonard stepped up to the open doors and held my gaze one final moment before we pulled away. He told me the private rehabilitation estate was fully prepared and locked down tight. He promised that by the time I opened my eyes tomorrow morning, Natasha and Garrett would be waking up to an entirely different world. He stepped back. The heavy doors swung shut, sealing me into a quiet, protected dark. The engine turned over with a low growl. We rolled out of the loading dock and slipped onto the empty streets. I watched through the small tinted window as the hospital shrank away behind us. Within a few hours, the sun would climb. Natasha would stir in my house, completely unaware that she was nothing more than a trespasser on someone else's property. She would sit by the phone, waiting for the nursing home transport to call with news that I'd been locked away for good. Instead, she was about to discover an empty hospital bed, an avoided legal contract. And Garrett would reach for his morning coffee only to find his credit cards were dead in his wallet and his entire company had been seized by an invisible hand. I closed my eyes and let the van's gentle rocking carry me under. The pain in my hip was still present, but the suffocating weight of betrayal had lifted entirely. I was no longer a man waiting to be discarded. I was a ghost dissolving into the night, leaving behind a perfectly laid trap for the predators who believed they had already buried me. I woke to birdsong outside a sweeping bay window. Morning light fell across my bed, washing over a room that resembled a luxury hotel suite far more than any medical ward. The sterile public hospital was behind me now. I was at a private, heavily secured rehabilitation estate tucked deep into wooded hills. Private security patrolled the grounds. The gates opened only to a biometric scan. Nobody was finding me here. I was completely beyond the reach of the people who had tried to have me killed. My physical therapist was a former military medic named Curtis. He arrived at precisely 8:00 in the morning, carrying a custom walker and wearing the expression of a man who did not entertain excuses. The next 2 hours were an education in sustained agony. Curtis pulled me out of that comfortable bed. He made me put weight on the reconstructed hip. Every step fired a jolt of heat straight up my spine. Sweat ran freely down my face. Every muscle in my body was protesting loudly. I didn't complain once. I welcomed the pain. The physical torture was a necessary burning, scorching away the helpless, broken father I had been. Each grinding step across that hardwood floor brought me closer to being whole again. I kept my focus locked on a single image, Garrett standing at the top of my basement stairs. By the time Curtis finally let me lower myself into the heavy leather recliner by the window, my body was spent, but my mind was fastened to a cold, clean edge. At exactly noon, the mahogany door to my suite opened. Leonard Morrow came in with his leather briefcase and a secure tablet and turned my recovery room into a corporate command center in under a minute. He dragged a chair alongside my recliner and snapped open the briefcase. Outside, the manicured gardens sat in peaceful afternoon light, a sharp contrast to the financial demolition we were executing inside these walls. Leonard handed me a cup of black coffee and set a thick stack of finalized legal documents on the table beside me. He walked me through the morning's developments. The commercial trust had formally absorbed the deed to my house. The state registry had been updated. Natasha and Garrett were now legally occupying a property held by a faceless corporate entity. Leonard allowed himself a cold, professional smile. He had already dispatched the official 72-hour eviction notice through a private process server. The clock on their fraudulent little domestic paradise was now running. I set my coffee down and lifted the heavy silver fountain pen. Leonard laid the first document before me, the formal asset seizure authorization for Apex Meridian Ventures. He explained that the forensic accounting team had spent the entire night charting Garrett's corporate structure, identifying his primary operating accounts, his payroll reserves, and his offshore tax shelters. I stared at the signature line. One stroke of ink would instantly freeze 3 million. It would trigger automatic clawback protocols, legally draining every cent Garrett possessed to settle the breached investment contract. I set the pen to paper and signed with complete steadiness. Leonard slid the next document across. It was a formal directive to the bank holding Garrett's business credit lines. Because the holding company had legally guaranteed those accounts, activating the morality clause gave me the right to sever that guarantee on the spot. I signed it. In that precise moment, the plastic card sitting in Garrett's expensive leather wallet became completely worthless. The third document was a legal injunction against the servers running Garrett's tech startup. Leonard explained that because my holding company held the intellectual property as collateral, we possessed the legal authority to lock the entire system pending a full audit. I signed. Years of Garrett's so-called brilliant work and thousands of lines of code were instantly walled off behind an impenetrable digital firewall. He was locked out of his own creation entirely. I passed the pen back to Leonard. The physical pain in my hip was a dull throb completely eclipsed by the deep, settled satisfaction of absolute control. I asked Leonard what the timeline was looking like. He checked his tablet and told me the bank freezes were already propagating through the financial network. The credit card cancellations would land in under an hour. The server lockouts were executing as we sat there. I eased back into the leather recliner and looked out at the hills. Natasha and Garrett had come home from their lavish anniversary trip, expecting to find a frightened, compliant old man. They had spent the past 3 days in my house, sleeping in my bed, drinking my wine, with no idea whatsoever that an invisible net had been drawing tight around them. They believed they had won by shoving an old man down a flight of stairs. What they failed to grasp was that the old man owned the stairs, the house, and every inch of ground beneath their feet. Leonard closed his briefcase and rose to leave. He told me the process server would deliver the eviction notice to the house the following morning. He suggested I rest and concentrate on therapy and promised to oversee the financial collapse from his office. I thanked him and watched him go. I was alone again, but loneliness had nothing to do with what I felt. What I felt was purpose. I reached for my tablet and pulled up the live feed from the hidden security cameras I had placed around my property years before. I settled in to watch my daughter and her husband face the total ruin of everything they thought they had secured. Natasha poured herself a double shot of espresso using the imported German machine sitting on my kitchen counter. She took a slow, deeply satisfied sip and gazed out through the wide bay windows at the manicured backyard. It was Wednesday morning, only hours after they had pressured me into signing my life away in that dim hospital room. She stood there in a pristine white silk robe, conducting herself exactly like the mistress of the house. There was not a trace of guilt anywhere in her bearing. She felt no remorse for pushing her own father down a flight of concrete stairs. She felt no pity for leaving him to rot in a state-funded facility. All she felt was the intoxicating rush of wealth she hadn't earned a single day in her life. She turned toward Garrett, who was seated at the custom mahogany dining table, fingers moving across his silver laptop without urgency. She told him they needed to move fast and aggressively. She wanted the house on the market by Friday afternoon. Her calculation was simple. A property sitting in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the county would pull in well over $2 million without breaking a sweat. Garrett didn't lift his eyes from the screen. He gave a single nod and agreed, noting that the sudden cash infusion would let them step up to a massive downtown penthouse while he expanded his software company at the same time. They were carving up my estate before the body had even cooled. They had arranged for Gloria Holt to come to the house at 900. Gloria was the sharpest, most formidable, and most exclusive real estate broker in the city. She dealt exclusively in multi-million-dollar estates, and she was precisely the kind of predator Natasha wanted handling her stolen asset. Right on schedule, the heavy brass knocker on the front door rang through the hallway. Natasha practically floated across the hardwood floor to answer it. Gloria stepped into the foyer, dressed in a perfectly fitted navy blue suit, a sleek leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She carried herself with the kind of authority that filled a room. Natasha welcomed her in with a saccharine smile and offered coffee and pastries. Gloria politely waved them off. Her schedule was tight, she said, and she preferred to go straight to the business at hand. Natasha eagerly led Gloria on a sweeping tour of the property. She walked through my home, pointing out architectural details, the vaulted ceilings, the custom crown molding. But at every turn, Natasha made a point of disparaging everything I had built. She called the Persian rugs tacky and dated. She told Gloria the dark wood-paneled library smelled like an old man and needed to be gutted down to the studs. She performed the role of a woman who had suffered through years of deprivation and was at last unveiling a hidden gem to the right buyer. Garrett followed along behind them, occasionally interjecting to boast about the square footage, as though he had swung the hammer himself. Gloria stayed perfectly neutral throughout. She took careful notes on her digital tablet, her eyes methodically sweeping each room, calculating the precise market value of every square inch. When the tour wrapped up, the three of them settled around the large dining room table. Natasha laced her fingers together and leaned forward, practically trembling with greed. She asked Gloria what the opening listing price should be and how fast they could expect a full cash offer. Gloria didn't answer right away. She set her tablet on the table and opened a specific application. She tapped through a few screens and a slight crease appeared in her brow. The energy in the room shifted immediately, the bloated, arrogant confidence pouring off Natasha, and Garrett ran directly into a wall of professional hesitation. Gloria looked up from the screen and straightened in her chair. In a calm, measured voice, she asked Natasha to clarify her precise legal relationship to the property. Natasha let out a sharp, contemptuous laugh. She announced that she was the sole legal owner. She explained that her elderly father had recently suffered a terrible accident, undergone a severe mental decline, and had willingly transferred the entire estate to her just the night before. She described my fictional dementia with a chilling absence of feeling. Gloria did not smile. She turned the tablet around and slid it across the polished mahogany table so Natasha and Garrett could see the screen. Gloria explained that her brokerage requires a preliminary title search and public registry check before taking on any new high-end listing, strictly to ensure there are no hidden liens or legal entanglements. She pressed a perfectly manicured finger against a highlighted section of the county database. According to the official state registry, she said updated at midnight, the property did not belong to Eugene Hartley, and it certainly did not belong to Natasha or Garrett. The deed to the four-bedroom estate had been legally and irrevocably transferred to Apex Meridian Commercial Trust 2 full days prior. The silence that settled over that dining room was total. Natasha stared at the glowing screen. The words, Apex Meridian Commercial Trust, reflected back from her wide, panicking eyes. She blinked repeatedly, her mind completely refusing to absorb what she was reading. Garrett leaned in his jaw, going slack as he read the official county seal and verified the digital record for himself. The color drained out of his face entirely. Natasha shot to her feet, her chair shrieking across the hardwood floor. Her voice cracked as she yelled that the database was wrong. It was a clerical error, a stupid bureaucratic blunder. She practically ran to her designer handbag sitting on the kitchen counter. She dug through it frantically and produced the leather folder holding the papers I had signed at the hospital. She rushed back to the table, yanked out the quitclaim deed, and slammed it down in front of Gloria. She jabbed a finger at my unsteady signature and screamed that she had the physical proof of ownership right there in black and white. Gloria didn't flinch. She was a professional who navigated legal disputes without blinking. She picked up the hospital document and reviewed it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she set it back on the table and delivered the single most devastating sentence my daughter had ever been forced to hear. Gloria explained that a quitclaim deed transfers only the interest a person actually holds in a property at the moment of signing. She looked Natasha directly in the eyes and told her that when Eugene Hartley signed that paper in the hospital the night before, he did not own the house. He had already moved the property into the commercial trust a day earlier. The hospital document, therefore, was entirely without value. It was a legally void piece of paper that transferred absolutely nothing. Garrett gripped the edge of the table. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. The reality landed on him like something physical. He recognized the name Apex Meridian. It was the same shadowy corporate entity that held the strings controlling his entire software company. The invisible hand that had bankrolled his life was the same hand that now held the deed to the roof over his head. Gloria rose from her chair, her expression cold and completely detached. She slipped her tablet into the leather portfolio and snapped it shut. She informed them that attempting to sell a property they had no legal claim to was a serious federal offense. Her brokerage would have no involvement whatsoever in a fraudulent listing. She didn't wait to be shown out. She turned on her heel and walked briskly to the front door, the heavy latch clicking shut behind her with a terrible finality. Natasha sank back into her chair. Her hands were trembling visibly. The gleaming vision of her wealthy future had just shattered beyond any hope of repair. She looked across the table at Garrett. Every trace of his habitual smirk was gone. He was staring blankly at the wall, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts of panic. They were not prospective millionaires on their way to a downtown penthouse. They were trespassers sitting in a house owned by a hostile corporation, and they were about to learn that losing the house was only the first wave of what was coming. I watched the live security feed on my tablet as the front door of my house swung shut. Gloria, the real estate broker, had walked out and left my daughter and her husband in a state of pure shock. Through the hidden camera in the living room, I watched Garrett pace back and forth like an animal that had just realized the cage door was locked. That trademark smirk of his had been completely wiped away. He dragged his hands through his hair and turned his voice on Natasha. He told her that Apex Meridian Commercial Trust was nothing but a shell company making a play to steal what was theirs. He still believed the world bent to his will. He snatched his car keys off the kitchen counter and told Natasha he was heading downtown to his office. He promised her he was going to wire a massive financial retainer to the most ruthless litigation firm in the city. He was convinced he could hire a small army of corporate lawyers to tear the trust apart and seize my house back by sheer force. He walked out the door, fully persuaded that his tech startup money made him untouchable. Garrett drove his expensive leased sports car into the downtown business district. I knew his office down to the last detail because my hidden money had financed every square inch of it. He leased the top floor of a premium high-rise and had fitted it out with imported Italian marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, and absurdly expensive ergonomic furniture. The whole setup was designed to project the image of a visionary tech billionaire. He stormed off the private elevator and blew past his receptionist without so much as a glance in her direction. He was a tyrant who treated the people beneath him with the same contemptuous dismissal he had shown me in that basement. He locked the heavy glass door of his corner office, threw his jacket onto the leather sofa, and flipped open his sleek silver laptop. He picked up the desk phone and placed a call to a high-powered defense attorney he had once shaken hands with at a country club. We are right at the edge of something I want you to sit with for just a moment, because what's coming next will show you how badly someone can miscalculate when they believe they're finally in control. Before we get there, if someone you loved had been quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and let the truth do its own work? He promised the lawyer a $100,000 wire transfer within the hour to kick off an aggressive lawsuit against the trust. He put the call on speakerphone and typed the web address for his executive corporate banking portal with the confidence of a man who had never once been told no. He navigated to the primary operating account of his software company, the massive vault still holding the remainder of the $3 million I had quietly invested to rescue his pathetic life 3 years earlier. Garrett punched in his complex authorization credentials and hit enter, fully expecting a screen full of commas and zeros to greet him. The page took 3 agonizing seconds to load. What appeared was not a balance. A glaring red banner blazed across the top of his expensive monitor. It read, "Error code 704, account frozen. Status restricted, available balance 0.0 zeros." Garrett stopped breathing. He sat motionless, his mind completely unable to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. He refreshed the page. He entered his secure password a second time, striking the keys so hard they rattled in the silence of the office. The same red banner came back. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He navigated to the secondary payroll account used to cover his engineers. Locked completely. Balance 0. He checked his offshore tax shelter. Access denied. Every digital vault connected to his name had been wiped clean in an instant. He ended the call with the high-powered lawyer without uttering a single syllable. His hands had begun to shake. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed his elite platinum business banker, aggressively bypassing the automated menu and demanding the regional corporate manager by name. The manager picked up. His tone was nothing like the fawning, eager deference Garrett had come to expect. It was ice-cold, purely administrative, stripped of every trace of respect. Garrett nearly screamed into the receiver. He demanded to know why some ridiculous system glitch was holding his critical business capital hostage. He threatened to sue the bank and pull his millions to a competitor before the day was out. The manager let him run the full length of his arrogant tirade without interruption. Then he delivered the killing blow. He informed Garrett there was no system glitch. He stated plainly that Apex Meridian Ventures, the primary guarantor and sole investor of the startup, had executed an emergency unilateral asset seizure at exactly $8 that morning. Garrett felt his throat tighten. His voice cracked as he argued frantically that they could not legally act without a formal board of directors vote. He shouted that he was the chief executive officer and he was ordering the freeze lifted immediately. The bank manager calmly explained that a board vote was not required when a level 4 breach of contract protocol had been triggered. Garrett gripped the edge of his mahogany desk. He demanded to know what the alleged breach of contract was. The manager audibly shuffled papers on his end of the line. He read directly from the legal injunction filed that morning by my attorney Leonard Morrow. He stated that Apex Meridian Ventures was exercising its absolute rights under Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Founder Agreement, specifically the Morality and Ethical Conduct Clause. The manager cleared his throat and read the legal justification aloud. The holding company was executing an immediate freeze of all operating capital, pending an active police investigation into felony. Elder abuse, aggravated assault, and gross moral turpitude. Those words hung in the air of Garrett's expensive corner office like a death sentence. Elder abuse, aggravated assault. The bank manager asked Garrett whether he needed the police incident report number tied to the financial freeze. Garrett's cell phone slipped from his hand and landed on the desk. The line stayed open, the manager's voice buzzing faintly from the speaker, but Garrett could not produce a single word. The invisible corporate holding company knew precisely what he had done in my basement. The full weight of that realization fell on him like a collapsing structure. The holding company that owned his entire business was called Apex Meridian Ventures. The trust that had just legally evicted him from his home was called Apex Meridian Commercial Trust. The mysterious billionaire investor he had been boasting about to friends for 3 solid years was the very same old man he had left to die on a freezing concrete floor. I was Apex Meridian. While Garrett stood frozen behind his desk, the second phase of the destruction protocol initiated automatically. The lights on his high-speed internet router flickered violently and went solid red. His computer screen died. A wall of scrolling white text filled the void, as the servers hosting his precious software were physically and digitally locked down by my cybersecurity team. The proprietary code he believed would make him famous was instantly encrypted and sealed behind an impenetrable digital firewall. He was locked out of his own creation entirely. He threw open his office door. The open floor plan beyond it was descending into chaos. His lead developers were rising from their desks, staring at dead monitors in bewilderment. The receptionist was arguing loudly with 3 large men in dark charcoal suits who had just stepped off the elevators, corporate auditors accompanied by private security contractors engaged directly by Leonard Morrow. The lead auditor crossed the floor without acknowledging the panicked employees and walked straight up to Garrett. He pressed a thick legal binder into his hands and demanded the surrender of his building access card on the spot. Garrett tried to square his shoulders. He attempted to assert authority and ordered the men off his property. The largest security contractor simply stepped forward, laid a heavy hand on Garrett's shoulder, and informed him that he was trespassing on Apex Meridian property. Garrett was marched out of his own office, paraded past his bewildered staff who watched their arrogant boss escorted out like a common criminal. He was not permitted to collect his expensive coat. He could not take his silver laptop or his car keys from his desk. He was put in the public elevator and sent down to street level with nothing but the clothes on his back. Back in my secure recovery suite, my cell phone buzzed on the table beside me. A secure text from Leonard Morrow. 2 words exactly. Target neutralized. I smiled, reached for my cup of black coffee and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. Garrett had walked into that building convinced he was a king about to bend the world to his will. He was thrown out onto the sidewalk 10 minutes later as a completely broken man. He had no money to retain a lawyer, no money to cover his rent. He couldn't even afford a cup of coffee. The parasite had been cleanly and surgically cut from the host, and his starvation had finally begun. Garrett did not drive his leased sports car back to my estate. He couldn't. The vehicle required a digital authorization key tied directly to his corporate executive account. While he was riding down in the elevator with the security contractors, my cybersecurity team had remotely deactivated his profile. When Garrett reached the underground parking garage, the car refused to unlock. His corporate platinum credit card was declined at the automated taxi stand outside the building. His personal bank card was rejected when he tried to book a premium rideshare on his phone. The man who had strutted into that office building, certain he was an industry titan, was forced to walk 2 miles in the afternoon heat to a public bus stop. He had to beg a city transit driver to let him ride for free because the expensive leather wallet in his pocket contained nothing but dead plastic. When Garrett finally pushed through the heavy mahogany front door of my home, he looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. He stumbled into the grand foyer, his tailored Italian suit soaked through with sweat and dusted with the grime of the city. Natasha was perched on the custom velvet sofa in the living room, nervously tapping her designer fingernails against her phone screen. She took one look at her husband's pale, hollowed-out face and immediately demanded to know what the lawyers had said. She asked how quickly they could file an injunction against the commercial trust and get the house back on the market. Garrett dropped into the armchair across from her. He couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at his expensive shoes and delivered the news in a flat, trembling voice. He told her there were no high-powered lawyers. He told her the business operating accounts were completely frozen. The executive credit lines had been canceled and the software servers were physically locked. Then he finally raised his eyes to his wife, wide with absolute terror, and laid out the most devastating truth of all. He told her that the anonymous billionaire investor they had worshipped for the past 3 years was no stranger at all. It was her father. It was me. Natasha froze. Every drop of color vacated her face. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, only a dry, choked gasp. Garrett pressed on his voice, fracturing with raw panic. He explained that my holding company had triggered a severe morality clause. He told her that I knew exactly what they had done in that basement. I had somehow engineered this entire financial slaughter from a hospital bed. They were broke, completely and entirely. They didn't have enough money to buy a loaf of bread, let alone retain a corporate defense attorney to wage war against a billionaire trust. Natasha's initial shock curdled quickly into a blinding, venomous fury. She flatly refused to accept that this was over. Her arrogance would simply not permit her to believe that the old man she had shoved down the stairs had outmaneuvered her so completely. She shot up from the velvet sofa and began pacing the living room like a cornered animal. She shouted that I was bluffing. She screamed that I was nothing but a weak, senile old man throwing a pathetic temper tantrum. She talked herself into believing I was still lying in that hospital bed, heavily sedated and locked firmly under her legal control. She snatched her cell phone from the coffee table. She told Garrett to stop weeping like a child. She declared that she still held full medical and financial power of attorney. She announced she was calling the hospital administration right now, ordering the doctors to have me declared legally incompetent and compelling the bank to unfreeze the accounts under her authority. She dialed the hospital's main number, hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. It rang 3 times before a senior administrative nurse picked up. Natasha skipped any greeting entirely. She went straight into a vicious, demanding tirade. She aggressively identified herself as the legal guardian and sole power of attorney for Eugene Hartley. She demanded to be transferred to my recovery room immediately. She insisted on speaking to the attending physician that very second to authorize a forced psychiatric evaluation. The nurse on the other end stayed perfectly composed, wholly unmoved by Natasha's hysteria. She asked Natasha to hold for a moment while she pulled up the digital patient records. 30 agonizing seconds of silence followed. Natasha drummed her foot on the floor, glaring at Garrett, silently promising him that her approach was about to fix everything he had failed to handle. The nurse came back on the line. Her voice was cold and entirely professional. She informed Natasha that Eugene Hartley was no longer a registered patient at their facility. Natasha's foot went still. Her grip tightened on the phone knuckles, blanching. She demanded to know exactly what the nurse meant by that. She asked whether I had been moved to the low-income state nursing home ahead of schedule and insisted on the address of the new facility immediately. The nurse corrected her with flat bureaucratic precision. Eugene Hartley had not been transferred to any state facility. At exactly midnight, she explained I had been formally discharged against medical advice, rolled out in a private medical transport, accompanied by my own personal legal counsel. Natasha completely lost control. She screamed into the phone that the hospital had committed a massive illegal act. She held the medical power of attorney, she shouted, and the staff had no right whatsoever to release a severely injured, mentally incompetent patient without her direct written consent. She threatened to sue the hospital, the nursing staff, and the entire medical board for criminal negligence and malpractice. The nurse did not waver at the threats. She simply read from the legal notes attached to my newly updated file. A private notary and a senior corporate attorney, she stated, had visited my room at midnight. I had executed a legally binding, fully notarized revocation of every prior power of attorney document. The papers Natasha was currently holding were completely void and legally worthless. What's more, the nurse explained, my new legal representative, Leonard Morrow, had placed a strict privacy block on my entire medical file. The hospital was legally forbidden from disclosing my location, my medical status, or any further information to anyone, including specifically my daughter. Before Natasha could launch into another threat, the nurse politely wished her a good day and ended the call. The line went dead. Natasha slowly brought the phone down from her ear. Her hand was shaking so badly that the device slipped from her fingers and cracked against the hardwood floor. She didn't even glance at it. The full reality of her situation finally broke through and shattered every delusion she had been clinging to. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't sedated. I was gone entirely. I had dissolved into thin air, leaving her standing in my living room, clutching a folder full of worthless paper. She looked across at Garrett. The enormous house felt suddenly very quiet and very cold. They were completely isolated. No money, no business, no legal authority over me whatsoever. And worst of all, no idea where I was or what was coming next. The invisible net had drawn completely tight around them. Pure, uncut panic took over. Garrett rose from the armchair, breathing in shallow bursts. He gestured toward the massive bay windows facing the front driveway. He brought up the eviction notice the real estate broker had mentioned. He said that the commercial trust would be sending officers to remove them from the property, and he suggested they pack whatever they could carry and leave before things escalated further. But Natasha's greed was a terminal disease with no cure. Even staring down total annihilation, she couldn't bring herself to release the wealth she believed she was owed by birthright. She swept her gaze around the grand living room, the high vaulted ceilings, the expensive art on the walls. She told Garrett they were absolutely not leaving. Corporate eviction proceedings take an enormous amount of time, she reasoned. It would take months, she insisted, for a trust to fight its way through housing court and legally remove them from a residential property. She had a plan, desperate, completely illegal, but a plan. They were going to squat in my $2 million estate. She told Garrett to go down to the garage and get his heavy toolbox. She ordered him to change every lock on the front, back, and side doors. She told him to nail the basement windows shut from the inside. She declared that this house was her castle, and no faceless corporation was taking it without a fight. She also understood they needed immediate cash just to survive the week. Their credit cards were useless, and their bank accounts held exactly nothing. Natasha's eyes moved across my collection of antique furniture, my vintage Persian rugs, and the glass display case in the study, holding my rare vintage watches. A desperate, predatory smile crossed her face. She told Garrett they were going to hold a massive cash-only estate sale that coming weekend. They would illegally sell off every valuable item in my home to private buyers before the authorities could force them out. It was a reckless, deeply criminal move born of desperation and insatiable greed. It was also exactly the move I had known they would make. It was the perfect setup for the final trap I had already laid. Saturday morning came in bright and clear. My house, the property now held by a commercial trust, had been completely transformed. Natasha and Garrett had spent the previous 48 hours tearing through my possessions like ravenous scavengers. They were cut off from the banking system entirely, no access to credit cards. They were starving for liquid cash to get through the weekend and fund a legal fight against the trust. Their brilliant, desperate solution, a massive cash-only estate sale dressed up as an exclusive weekend cocktail party. Through the high-definition security cameras hidden in the ceilings, I watched the desecration of everything I had built. Natasha had hired a cheap catering company using the very last few dollars from my emergency kitchen drawer. Waiters circulated through my living room, carrying trays of cheap champagne. The house was packed with dozens of wealthy, completely unsuspecting buyers from the surrounding neighborhood. They believed they had been invited to a chic liquidation event. They had no idea they were participating in the mass fencing of stolen property. Natasha was stationed near the grand fireplace in one of her most expensive designer dresses, holding a crystal glass and performing the role of the grief-stricken, devoted daughter with practiced perfection. I listened through the hidden microphones as she lied to a cluster of potential buyers without blinking. She told them her poor father had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She claimed I had been permanently relocated to a specialized memory care facility, and that she was simply liquidating the estate to cover my astronomical medical bills. The buyers nodded with genuine sympathy and then eagerly pressed thick stacks of $100 bills into her hands for my personal belongings. I watched her sell the antique mahogany writing desk I had brought back from London 30 years ago. A local doctor paid $4,000 in cash for it. She had no idea that desk contained the original blueprints for my first logistics warehouse. To her, it was nothing but an old piece of furniture standing between her and a downtown penthouse. She stuffed the cash straight into a designer handbag propped on the mantel. Her eyes were glazed over with undisguised greed. She actually believed she was getting the better of me, that converting my physical possessions into untraceable paper money would hand her the ammunition to fight the invisible trust. In the adjacent study, Garrett was running his own illegal auction. He looked wretched. His expensive suit was visibly rumpled, and dark circles had carved themselves under his eyes. The shock of losing his entire software company was consuming him from the inside. He stood behind my heavy oak desk, desperately bargaining with a group of local jewelry collectors. Spread across the desktop was my entire collection of vintage mechanical watches. These were not simply watches. They were the physical markers of my life's journey. The platinum chronograph I bought the day my logistics company went public. The rose gold dress watch my late wife gave me on our 20th anniversary. Garrett did not give a moment's thought to their history or what they meant. He cared only about preserving his own inflated ego. I watched him argue heatedly with a buyer over a rare Swiss timepiece. The buyer offered $8,000. Garrett, visibly sweating, pushed for $10,000, insisting he needed the cash immediately to lock in a high-powered corporate lawyer. The buyer wavered, then produced a thick envelope from his jacket and counted out $9,000. Garrett snatched the money off the desk with shaking hands and shoved it into a brown leather satchel on the floor. He had the look of a desperate man emptying a vault with sirens already wailing in the distance. He kept checking his phone obsessively, waiting for some miracle to restore his access to the frozen bank accounts. The invisible wall that had crashed down on his life had him in a state of pure terror. But instead of humility or remorse, that fear expressed itself as reckless greed. He moved straight to the next buyer, holding up my late wife's sapphire pendant necklace. I bought her for her college graduation, and auctioning it to the highest bidder without a single shred of hesitation. He was selling his mother-in-law's ghost to keep his leased sports car. I sat in my secure recovery suite miles away, watching the live feed on my tablet. My physical therapist had just finished a grueling 2-hour session. My surgically repaired hip throbbed with a dull, steady ache, but I left the prescribed painkillers untouched. I needed my mind razor-sharp and fully present for the climax of this war. I watched these two parasites strip my life down to bare walls. A weaker man might have wept seeing his memories sold off for pennies. A different father might have called the police at that very moment to stop the theft. But I didn't move a finger to intervene. I let them pull the expensive oil paintings from the walls. I'd let them sell the vintage watches. I let them pack their designer bags with completely illegal cash. I needed them fully committed to the crime, publicly and irrevocably. I needed the house packed with high-profile witnesses. I needed the stolen money physically in their hands, so the criminal charges would be beyond dispute in any court in the country. Every dollar they collected was another loop of the legal noose they were tightening around their own necks. They were carefully constructing their own prison cell. I was simply observing the work. The digital clock on my tablet read 2 in the afternoon. The estate sale was hitting its absolute peak. The grand living room buzzed with wealthy buyers, comparing their newly acquired stolen treasures. Natasha was laughing loudly at something a neighbor had said, her designer bag fat with illicit cash. She sipped champagne, feeling entirely triumphant. In the study, Garrett was zipping shut the heavy leather satchel. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, genuinely convinced he now had enough untraceable money to retain a legal team and launch his counterattack against Apex Meridian. They believed they had weathered the storm. They thought they had found a clever loophole inside my trap, but my trap had no loopholes. It had only steel teeth. Then the atmosphere in the living room shifted all at once. The loud, self-satisfied chatter began to die down rapidly. The buyers gathered near the massive bay windows, stopped talking, and started pointing outside. I pulled up the live feed from the exterior driveway camera. The guests had spotted something large moving toward the house. Natasha registered the sudden quiet. Her laughter cut off instantly as she turned toward the front of the property. The smug, victorious smile dissolved from her face in seconds. Garrett emerged from the study, clutching his leather satchel full of cash. He read the room, immediately looked out through the large glass window, and his jaw nearly hit the floor. A massive heavy-duty commercial moving truck had just turned onto my private driveway, but it hadn't come alone. Following close behind it was a tight convoy of 3 sleek, entirely black sport utility vehicles. They didn't park courteously along the street. They came up the long driveway with purpose, completely blocking in the luxury cars belonging to the estate sale guests. The trap had stopped being an invisible financial mechanism. It was now driving directly up to their front door. The moving truck's heavy diesel engine sent a deep vibration through the air that rattled the expensive glass of the living room windows. The 3 matte black SUVs followed in tight, aggressive formation, not pulling to the curb, but rolling straight across the manicured front lawn, their heavy tires tearing through the landscaping and sealing off the driveway entirely. They formed an impenetrable wall of metal boxing in every luxury sedan and sports car belonging to the guests. The trap had arrived in the physical world. The mood inside the house lurched from celebration to breathless dread within seconds. Wealthy doctors, local politicians, and neighborhood gossips set down their champagne glasses and pressed themselves against the bay windows, pointing at the vehicles outside. Natasha dropped her crystal glass. It hit the hardwood floor and exploded into jagged pieces, but she didn't look down. Her face turned the color of ash. The triumphant expression she had worn all morning was gone, replaced by raw, undisguised panic. Garrett stood frozen in the doorway of the study, still gripping the leather satchel, crammed with thousands of dollars in illicit cash. His heart hammered against his ribs. He recognized those black vehicles immediately. The same corporate security contractors had physically marched him out of his own software company just 2 days ago. He understood with absolute certainty that this was not a mistake. This was the invisible hand of Apex Meridian reaching out to crush the very last sanctuary he had left in the world. 12 men stepped out of the vehicles in unison. They were not local police officers. They wore no standard blue uniforms and carried none of the patient bearing of public servants. Instead, they wore matching tactical charcoal suits with discreet communication earpieces tucked behind their ears, and they moved with synchronized military precision that silenced the room. They fanned out and surrounded the entire perimeter of the property front door, side gates, backyard, patio, sealing every exit. They were a private corporate asset recovery team, and they carried themselves like an army preparing for a siege. The lead agent stepped out from the center vehicle. He was tall and heavily built, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been cut from stone. He didn't appear angry. He looked entirely bored, which made him considerably more frightening. He carried a thick metallic clipboard in his left hand. He climbed the stone steps to the front porch with slow, unhurried strides, each bootfall striking the wood with a heavy, deliberate echo, like a clock counting down to total ruin. Natasha made a desperate bid to regain control of the situation. Her ego simply would not allow her to accept that she had been completely outmatched. She smoothed her designer dress, forced the counterfeit smile back onto her face, and pulled the front door open before the agent could raise his hand to knock. She pushed her shoulders back and tried to project the commanding presence of a woman who owned every inch of the ground she stood on. She demanded loudly to know who these people were and what gave them the right to crash her private weekend cocktail gathering. She threatened to ring the mayor and have every last one of them hauled away for trespassing. The lead agent didn't so much as flinch. Her theatrical fury washed over him without effect. He planted himself exactly 2 feet in front of her and looked down with pure, undisguised contempt. He made no attempt to lower his voice or pull her aside. He threw his words across the room with deliberate volume and clarity, making absolutely certain every well-heeled guest crowded into the foyer and living room caught every syllable. He identified himself as Agent Dunmore, Regional Director of Asset Recovery for Apex Meridian Commercial Trust. Natasha drew a breath to interrupt, but Agent Dunmore silenced her instantly. He raised the heavy metallic clipboard between them. He announced to the dead-silent room that the property beneath their feet was the legal possession of a commercial corporation. He stated that the prior owner, Eugene Hartley, had lawfully transferred the deed before his medical discharge. His gaze swept across the wealthy guests clutching my antique furnishings, my expensive paintings, and my late wife's jewelry. Then he delivered a legal warning that detonated through the room like a bomb. Agent Dunmore informed the crowd that Natasha and Garrett held absolutely no legal authority to sell a single item inside this house. He stated plainly that every transaction conducted here today was entirely fraudulent. He explained that acquiring corporate assets from unauthorized parties constituted the felony receipt of stolen property. He told the horrified guests that they were active participants in a large-scale illegal fencing operation, and that every one of them was presently holding stolen corporate evidence in their hands. The reaction was instant and completely unhinged. These were people who guarded their spotless reputations like fortresses. The mere suggestion of felony charges and stolen goods sent them into a full-blown frenzy. A prominent local surgeon dropped the antique vase he'd just purchased, as if it had burned him. A wealthy socialite frantically unclasped the sapphire pendant necklace from around her neck and flung it onto the nearest table, as if the metal itself were on fire. The guests grasped that they had been thoroughly conned. They turned every ounce of their collective fury directly onto Natasha and Garrett. Dozens of furious people began screaming at my daughter. They demanded their cash returned on the spot. They called her a thief and a con artist. Natasha backed toward the wall, both hands raised, utterly overwhelmed by the vicious rage of her own country club circle. She fumbled through some excuse about a terrible misunderstanding, but no one in that room was willing to hear another word from her. The carefully constructed illusion of her lavish life collapsed entirely, and what it exposed underneath the designer clothes was a pathetic cornered criminal. In the middle of the bedlam, Garrett made a catastrophic choice. The pressure shattered something in him completely. He looked at the heavy leather satchel in his hands stuffed with nearly $30,000 in untraceable cash, the last money he had left anywhere on earth. He turned his back on the living room and bolted for the kitchen set, unslipping out the back door and disappearing into the thick woods behind the property. He gave no thought to his wife. His only instinct was self-preservation. He burst through the swinging kitchen doors and ran straight into a wall of solid muscle. 2 corporate security agents had already sealed the rear exit. They seized Garrett by the shoulders and drove him hard into the stainless steel refrigerator. The impact knocked every bit of air from his lungs. The heavy leather satchel slipped from his sweaty grip and struck the tile floor, bursting wide open. Thick bricks of $100 bills tumbled out, scattering across the kitchen in every direction. One agent pinned Garrett against the appliance, while the other calmly crouched and began gathering the scattered cash. That agent informed Garrett the money was being formally seized as direct evidence of illicit corporate theft. Garrett struggled feebly against the iron-gripped tears of pure terror and frustration pouring down his face. He sobbed and begged them to leave him just a few $100s so he could buy food. The agents didn't acknowledge his pleading. Back in the front hallway, Agent Dunmore stepped past a completely paralyzed Natasha. He moved into the center of the living room and issued a final command to the panicked crowd. He ordered everyone not residing in the house to vacate the premises at once. He warned that anyone still inside the property in exactly 2 minutes would be detained and turned over to local police for criminal processing. The guests needed no further persuasion. They practically trampled one another, stampeding through the front door, abandoning their purchases and leaving their cash where it lay. They sprinted across the lawn toward their blocked luxury vehicles, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the radioactive wreckage of my daughter's life. Natasha was left standing alone in the center of the room, hemmed in by abandoned antiques and stone-faced security contractors. The estate sale was finished, and the final reckoning had formally arrived. The fleeing guests churned the front lawn into chaos. Luxury cars reversed recklessly across the manicured grass, clawing to break free of the corporate blockade. But the mass exodus ground to a sudden stop. A heavy quiet fell over the property as a large custom medical transport van rolled slowly up the center of the driveway, parting the row of black security vehicles like a curtain. The van came to rest directly in front of the grand entrance. The rear doors swung open with a heavy metallic clack, a mechanized hydraulic ramp descending slowly to the pavement. I did not look like the broken, discarded old man they had left to die on a freezing concrete floor. I did not look like the frightened victim shaking in a hospital bed. I was dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that concealed my heavy medical bandages. I sat perfectly upright in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair. I guided the chair down the ramp with practiced precision. Leonard Morrow walked closely at my side, a thick leather binder held under his arm. Two large private security contractors flanked me on either side, hands resting carefully near their utility belts. The stragglers who had been too stunned to flee stood frozen on the lawn, staring at me as though they could not trust their own eyes. Natasha was on the front porch. The stolen cash from the estate sale was the last thing on her mind. Her eyes were stretched wide with a terror so deep it looked as though she were staring at a ghost. In every meaningful sense, she was. The father she had known was gone entirely. The man steering up her driveway was the chief executive of her absolute destruction. I maneuvered my wheelchair along the smooth concrete path toward the front steps and stopped exactly 10 FT from my daughter. The front door opened behind her. Two corporate agents marched Garrett out onto the porch, his arms locked firmly behind his back. His expensive suit was a ruin. His face was streaked with tears and sweat. He looked down at me in the wheelchair, and his whole body began to tremble. He understood at last the full magnitude of what he had miscalculated. I looked out across my property. I saw my antique chairs sitting carelessly on the lawn. I saw my late wife's silver tea set shoved into a cardboard box. A surge of cold, calculated anger moved through me, but I kept my voice down. No screaming, no theatrics. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a man who held every card in the deck. I told Natasha the estate sale was officially canceled. Leonard Morrow stepped forward. He opened the leather binder and drew out a thick stack of heavily stamped legal documents. He passed them to me. I raised the packet so Natasha and Garrett could see the golden seals of the state court clearly. I told them these were nothing like the fraudulent downloaded forms they had coerced me into signing in that hospital room. I explained that what I was holding was an immediate court-ordered eviction notice covering the property they were currently trespassing on. Beyond that, I held the fully executed asset seizure warrants for Apex Meridian Ventures. I looked directly into Garrett's bloodshot eyes. I told him his corporate accounts had already been liquidated. I told him his software servers had been physically seized and his building access permanently revoked. I watched the last remaining trace of hope drain from his face entirely. He buckled to his knees right there on the wooden porch, sobbing, begging the security guards to release him. But Natasha was a completely different breed of monster. Her greed and arrogance were so deeply embedded that she genuinely could not process her own defeat. Even surrounded by a private army staring down absolute financial ruin, she would not yield. She looked at the cluster of wealthy neighbors and country club gossips watching from the edge of the lawn. She spotted an audience and she went straight to work. She manufactured an expression of hysterical, shattered heartbreak. She erupted into violent theatrical tears. She moved a step toward my wheelchair, arms extended as if she meant to embrace me. The security contractors stepped directly into her path, forming a solid wall of muscle and cutting her off completely. Natasha stopped and dramatically buried her face in her hands. She wailed at full volume, throwing her voice so the entire neighborhood could hear every syllable. She cried out that I was in the grip of a severe mental breakdown. She shouted to the onlookers that I was a deeply sick, senile old man who had wandered away from a psychiatric ward. She claimed the medications had hollowed out my mind entirely, and that I had hired these phony security guards in a fit of paranoid dementia. She thrust a trembling finger toward Leonard Morrow. She accused him of being a corrupt, predatory attorney, exploiting a mentally incompetent elderly man. She screamed that she was my legal guardian and demanded someone contact the real police to have me safely returned to the hospital before I caused harm to myself. She played the victim with such terrifying, absolute conviction that a handful of the remaining neighbors actually began murmuring in sympathy. They glanced at me in the wheelchair and found themselves wondering whether the beautiful weeping daughter might be telling the truth. She looked straight at me through her manufactured tears. Then she let her voice fall to a harsh, venomous whisper meant for my ears alone. She told me I was completely pathetic. She said no judge alive would take the word of a delusional old man over a devoted daughter. She promised that the moment real law enforcement arrived, she would have me committed to a padded cell for whatever remained of my miserable life. She still believed she could outmaneuver me with a few fake tears and a loud performance. I did not cut her off. I let her spin her web. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly wanted. I watched her with a mixture of profound pity and cold disgust. I told her she was a remarkable actress. I acknowledged her gift for staring a crowd straight in the face and lying without a flicker of hesitation. But I explained her performance carried one fatal flaw. In the modern world, I told her words cost nothing, but high-definition digital data was absolutely priceless. I reached into the side pocket of my wheelchair and drew out a sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen and linked the device directly to the central smart home hub, controlling the large wireless speakers mounted throughout the property. I had bought and installed that sound system years ago to enjoy jazz music on the patio. Tonight, it was going to serve a far darker purpose. Natasha's crying stopped. She fixed her eyes on the tablet in my hand, and a new, very real terror began to seep into her expression. The stage was perfectly arranged for the final lethal blow. The murmurs of the shaken crowd hung in the warm afternoon air. Natasha still had her face pressed into her hands, forcing out tears, waiting for the wealthy neighbors to rush forward and console her. She was a master manipulator, relying entirely on the standard social assumption that a crowd will always side with a weeping, distressed woman over a disabled old man. She believed she could dictate the entire narrative, but she had fundamentally misjudged the battlefield. We were no longer trading in the subjective currency of emotion and public opinion. We had moved into the cold, unforgiving territory of hard digital evidence. I sat perfectly still in my motorized wheelchair. I looked down at the sleek silver tablet resting on my lap. I had no intention of raising my voice to dispute her accusations. I had no interest in frantically persuading the wealthy onlookers of my sanity. Defending yourself against a frenzied liar only lends their lies a credibility they don't deserve. Instead, I simply tapped the network settings icon on the screen. I turned to the crowd and spoke with a calm, measured authority that sliced cleanly through Natasha's theatrical sobbing. I explained to the silent onlookers that when my wife passed away 5 years ago, I found myself alone in a very large, empty estate. For my own peace of mind, I had engaged a premium private security firm to wire the entire property with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. I had high-definition cameras and highly sensitive omnidirectional microphones installed throughout the hallways, the living room, and the basement. The entire recording system was integrated directly into the central smart home network. Garrett and Natasha were aware of the basic alarm keypad by the front door, but they had written me off as a clueless senior who could barely manage a television remote. They had absolutely no idea that every corner of this house was continuously capturing audio and video and pushing it to an encrypted cloud server. I swiped my finger across the tablet screen. A sharp, clear electronic chime rang out from the large outdoor speakers mounted beneath the wooden eaves of the front porch. The identical chime sounded from the living room and the study inside. Every speaker on the property had synced to my device. The house itself was about to testify against them. The moment Natasha heard that Bluetooth connection chime, her false sobbing cut off instantly. Her hands fell from her face. Her perfectly manicured fingers began to tremble. She stared at the outdoor speakers, then turned her head slowly to look directly at me. The sociopathic mask of the grieving victim shattered completely, exposing the raw, naked terror beneath it. She understood in that instant what I was holding. She understood that the basement stairwell was not a silent, unrecorded tomb. I turned my gaze to the crowd of wealthy neighbors. I told them that my daughter had just stood on this porch and declared me a senile man consumed by severe delusions. I told them she had just sworn she was a devoted, loving caregiver, trying only to protect her ailing father. I asked them to listen very carefully to the unvarnished truth. I told them they were about to hear exactly what took place on Thursday afternoon, just minutes before Natasha and Garrett left for a luxury anniversary vacation in Hilton Head Island. I pressed play on the glass screen. For a brief moment, there was only the faint static of ambient room noise. Then the crisp, unmistakable audio from the basement camera began broadcasting across the entire estate. The volume was calibrated perfectly, carrying the voices clearly across the manicured lawn. The crowd heard Natasha's voice first. It bore no resemblance to the sobbing, fragile voice she had just used to beg for their sympathy. It was cruel and harsh and soaked in venom. The massive speakers sent her words across the yard. They heard her mocking my age. They heard her aggressively informing me that my slight limp was a liability and demanding I sign the deed of my house over to her. They heard me refuse. They heard me tell them both to pack their things and get off my property immediately. The onlookers stood completely frozen. The socialite who had been murmuring in Natasha's defense just minutes before pressed both hands over her mouth. The prominent surgeon who had purchased my writing desk stared at the speakers in open horror. The grand illusion of the loving daughter was incinerated in an instant, but the recording was not done. It was about to become far worse. The speakers picked up the heavy sound of my footsteps moving toward the hallway phone. Then came the sudden, violent noise of physical exertion. The crowd heard Natasha grunt as she drove into me with her full weight. They heard my sharp gasp of shock. What came next made several people in the crowd physically flinch. The heavy booming audio captured the sickening thud of my body, striking the top wooden step. It captured the chaotic, violent tumbling as I fell backward down the steep staircase. The microphones caught the wrenching crack of my ribs meeting the wooden railing. And then the recording delivered its most devastating moment, the bone-crushing impact of my body hitting the solid concrete floor at the bottom of the basement. A woman in the crowd let out a horrified, piercing gasp. Complete silence followed the terrible crash on the recording. Only my ragged, agonized wheezing echoed from the porch speakers, the unmistakable sound of a broken man fighting to stay alive in the total dark. On the porch, Garrett was sobbing uncontrollably, thrashing weakly in the iron grip of the corporate security agents. He was begging me to cut the audio off. He was screaming that he was desperately sorry, but I did not touch the tablet. I made him stand there and listen to his own damnation. The digital recording continued. The crowd heard careful footsteps approaching the top of the stairs. They heard the floorboards creak as Garrett and Natasha looked down at my broken body below. The silence on the tape stretched for 5 agonizing seconds while they made their decision. Then Garrett's voice rang out across the lawn, crisp clear and entirely stripped of human empathy. The high-end speakers carried his exact words without mercy. Maybe now he will get the message. Let him die down there. The crowd broke into loud murmurs of absolute revulsion. The final sound on the recording was the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt, sealing me inside the freezing basement, followed by the muffled sound of their luxury car pulling away toward wine country. I pressed a button on the screen, and the audio cut out completely. The silence that settled over the property was heavier than lead. It was the absolute silence of total, inescapable judgment. I looked at my daughter. She was no longer standing tall on the porch. Her knees had given out entirely. She had crumpled against the wooden railing, sliding down until she was sitting on the grimy floorboards. She stared blankly at the grass, her mind completely undone. There were no manufactured tears left to shed. There were no more lies left to construct. Her entire social standing, her spotless reputation, and her financial future had just been publicly executed in front of the most influential people in her city. The wealthy neighbors regarded her as though she were something diseased. The same people who had been drinking her cheap champagne barely 20 minutes earlier were now stepping back, actively working to put as much physical space between themselves and her as they could manage. She had been fully exposed as a violent sociopathic parasite who had literally left her own father to bleed out on a concrete floor simply to steal his house. I placed the silver tablet securely back into the side pocket of my wheelchair. I had nothing further to say to the horrified crowd. The digital evidence had made the argument for me. The silent adjustment was officially complete. I had not laid a single finger on either of them. I had not thrown a punch or raised my voice in anger even once. I had simply held up a mirror and compelled the entire world to stare at the darkness living inside their souls. The lethal blow had landed cleanly, and the monsters were finally permanently slain. The silence that followed the recording was broken abruptly by the sound of a crystal vase shattering on the driveway. One of the wealthy neighbors had simply let the stolen antique fall from her hands. She didn't bother retrieving the pieces. She didn't ask for a refund. She turned her back on Natasha and walked briskly toward her vehicle. That single act shattered the spell entirely. The remaining guests dissolved into a frantic, uncoordinated stampede of self-preservation. These were people whose entire lives were built on social status, local political connections, and immaculate public reputations. The sudden understanding that they were standing in the middle of an active crime scene, holding stolen property, while listening to a recording of an attempted murder, sent them into absolute panic. They dropped everything on the spot. Expensive oil paintings were abandoned against the manicured hedges. Vintage silver platters were tossed carelessly across the front lawn. The wealthy socialites and prominent businessmen practically stumbled over one another, getting as far from my daughter as their legs could carry them. Not one of them offered Natasha a single word of comfort. They treated her as if she were highly contagious. The private corporate security agent stepped to the side, opening a clear path for the departing guests, while keeping a sharp eye on every piece of abandoned merchandise. The agents let everyone leave freely, but they made certain not one piece of my legacy walked out the gate. I sat in my wheelchair and watched the grand illusion of my daughter's social world dissolve into nothing. For 3 years, she had constructed her entire identity around impressing these shallow people. She had purchased their friendship with my money. She had thrown their lavish parties on my credit cards. She had ached for their validation. And now, the instant the truth came to light, they left her without a single backward glance. The luxury sedans and sports cars that had been bottled up behind the black security vehicles were now frantically maneuvering across my ruined landscaping. Expensive tires carved deep furrows into the green grass as guests forced their way past the corporate blockade. Within 3 minutes, the once crowded front lawn stood completely empty. Nothing left but the abandoned antiques scattered across the grass and the security team holding the iron perimeter. Natasha remained on the dirty floorboards of the front porch, utterly motionless. The reality of her total social annihilation had short-circuited something in her. She stared blankly at the torn-up grass mouth, slightly open, unable to begin processing the scale of what had just happened to her. Garrett was still pinned against the exterior wall of the house by 2 security agents, his head hanging in absolute defeat. The silence returned to the estate, but it was a different silence now. It was the heavy, expectant quiet that comes just before a massive storm breaks. Then, a new sound cut through the warm afternoon air. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail, echoing up from the main road at the bottom of the long hill. Within seconds, it grew louder and unmistakable. Multiple police sirens blaring hard and closing fast. Natasha's head snapped up. The blank stare vanished, replaced in an instant by sheer unfiltered terror. She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading in a way I had never seen from her before. She now understood that the corporate security team was not the final punishment. She finally grasped that losing the house, the money, and the social standing was only the opening act of her nightmare. The sirens were multiplying in volume, ricocheting off the surrounding trees and rolling across the property with terrifying clarity. Garrett began thrashing violently against the security agent's grip. He screamed that he could not go to state prison. He sobbed and begged me to call the authorities off. He pleaded that it was all a terrible mistake, that he had never truly meant to hurt me, that he had simply been angry and under enormous pressure over his business. His pathetic whimpering was completely swallowed by the deafening approach of the sirens. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply watched him with cold, detached observation. The window for apologies had closed the moment he turned that deadbolt. Leonard Morrow stepped forward from his position beside my wheelchair. He looked down at Natasha, who was now trembling so violently she could barely hold herself upright against the wooden railing. Leonard straightened his suit jacket and spoke in the calm, measured tone of a man who had choreographed this precise sequence of events down to the last second. He told Natasha that the local police department was not responding to a noise complaint or a neighborhood dispute. He explained that exactly 10 minutes before our corporate convoy had arrived at the estate, he had personally contacted the chief of police. Leonard stated that he had already transmitted the digital audio recording of the basement incident directly and securely to the lead detective of the Criminal Investigation Division. He informed her that he had also delivered the fraudulent hospital documents she had coerced me into, signing proof of her calculated intent to strip my assets while I lay incapacitated. Then he looked directly into her terrified eyes and delivered the final piece of information. He told her that the officers currently racing up the hill were not coming to ask questions or arbitrate a family dispute. They were executing an active judge-approved felony warrant for aggravated assault, elder abuse, and attempted manslaughter. Natasha opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. She looked at the red and blue lights now strobing violently through the tall trees at the edge of the driveway. 3 marked police cruisers tore through the open front gates, tires screaming as they hit the pavement. They cut aggressively across the property, boxing in the black security vehicles and sealing off every possible avenue of escape. The trap was fully closed. The financial empire had been dismantled. The stolen property had been recovered. The social standing had been ground to dust. Now the final phase of the silent adjustment was climbing out of those police cruisers to collect what was owed. I rested my hands calmly on the armrests of my wheelchair, positioned perfectly to watch my daughter face the full consequences of her own monstrous greed. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the black and white cruisers. They moved with absolute unhurried authority, hands resting on their heavy-duty belts. Behind them, an unmarked gray sedan pulled up and stopped on the torn grass of my front lawn. The driver's door opened and Detective Canfield stepped out into the warm afternoon air. He was the same detective who had come to my hospital room just 2 days before. He was the man I had lied to about tripping in the dark. He took in the massive private security perimeter, the abandoned antiques scattered across the driveway, and then his eyes found mine as I sat in my motorized wheelchair. He did not look angry that I had misled him. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of professional respect crossed his weathered face. He grasped immediately that my lie in the hospital had not been an act of fear. It was a calculated tactical move designed to build an airtight, undeniable case against them. Leonard Morrow walked down the smooth concrete path to meet the detective halfway. There were no pleasantries exchanged, no handshake. Leonard simply passed Detective Canfield the silver tablet and a thick manila envelope holding the legally voided power of attorney documents. Canfield pulled up the video file on the screen. The uniformed officers immediately fanned out in a tight perimeter around the front porch, cutting off any chance of Natasha or Garrett making a desperate break for the dense woods behind the house. I watched Detective Canfield's face as he reviewed the high-definition security footage from my basement stairwell. The bright screen of the tablet reflected clearly in his steady, observant eyes. He watched my own daughter place her hands against my chest and drive me backward into the dark. He watched my body break apart against the hard concrete floor. Then the crisp audio came through the tablet speaker. Canfield heard Garrett deliver his chilling death sentence. The detective's jaw went tight. Every trace of professional neutrality drained from his expression, replaced at once by a look of profound, absolute disgust. He handed the tablet back to Leonard Morrow without a single word. He turned his full attention to the front porch. Detective Canfield climbed the wooden steps slowly and deliberately. Natasha backed away from him until her spine pressed flat against the heavy front door. She raised both hands, her chest heaving with uncontrolled panic. She made one final desperate attempt to resurrect her shattered victim act. She stammered that the video had been ripped completely out of context. She claimed she had simply lost her footing and bumped into me by accident. She jabbed a trembling finger in my direction and cried out that I was a vindictive old man trying to destroy her life because I was in the grip of severe dementia. Detective Canfield did not break his stride for a single step. He moved directly into her space and locked his hand around her right wrist with a grip like iron. He told her to save her pathetic excuses for the judge. He wrenched her arm firmly behind her back. Natasha screamed in genuine shock as the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around her wrist. That sharp metallic click rang out across the silent property. It was the unmistakable final sound of her freedom ending. Canfield seized her other arm, cutting through her violent thrashing without pause, and secured the steel cuffs together. He recited her Miranda rights in a flat-measured monotone that entirely drowned out her hysterical sobbing. He formally charged her with felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and attempted manslaughter. He added that because she had locked the door and left the state while I lay bleeding on a concrete floor, she was also being charged with depraved, heart-reckless endangerment. Natasha stopped fighting. Her legs gave out completely beneath her. Had the detective not been holding her upright by her arms, she would have crumpled into a heap on the dirty floorboards. The pristine designer dress she had chosen to impress the wealthy neighborhood was now badly wrinkled and dark with sweat. Her perfect, glamorous life was officially finished. Garrett watched his wife being handcuffed with wide, terror-filled eyes. He understood in that instant that his only remaining play was to turn entirely against the woman he had married. The cowardice that had defined his whole existence seized absolute control. He pressed his back against the exterior wall of the house and leveled a finger directly at Natasha. He shouted to the officers that he had absolutely nothing to do with the physical assault. He screamed that she was unstable, that she had shoved me in a sudden fit of rage, and that he had been too frightened of her violent temper to call an ambulance. He actually attempted to cast himself as a victim of her domestic manipulation. Natasha's head snapped up. The ultimate betrayal from her own husband ignited a flash of pure venomous hatred in her eyes. She screamed back at him, her voice cracking with absolute fury. She shouted that locking the door had been his idea entirely. She yelled to the officers that Garrett was the one who said to let me die down there so they could take the house and bankroll his pathetic failing tech startup. They were tearing each other apart right there on my front porch, each one trading their marital vows for desperate futile bids to save their own skin. Detective Canfield looked at Garrett with a degree of contempt normally reserved for insects. He signaled two of the uniformed officers. They moved quickly up the steps, grabbed Garrett by the shoulders, and spun him around hard. Garrett sobbed and pleaded as the officers drove him face first into the wooden siding of the house. They yanked his arms behind his back and locked the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Canfield positioned himself right beside Garrett's ear and told him that the digital audio had captured his voice, sealing my fate with perfect clarity. The detective stated that the legal duty of care laws in this state made Garrett fully culpable for my injuries. He formally arrested Garrett as an accessory to felony elder abuse, accessory to attempted manslaughter, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Garrett dissolved completely crying, loudly and helplessly, like a frightened child, as the officers patted him down and emptied his expensive pockets. The officers gripped Natasha and Garrett firmly by the arms and began marching them down the wooden steps. This was the ultimate walk of absolute shame. They were paraded past the scattered wreckage of their illegal estate sale. They walked past the expensive antique furniture they had so desperately tried to steal from me. They walked. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, I want to say thank you. Truly, it means more than you know. This wasn't a simple story about revenge. It was about what happens when a person spends their whole life building something real, a business, a home, a name, only to have the people closest to them decide it was theirs to take. Eugene lost his health on that basement floor. He lost months of his life, but he never once lost his sense of what was right. I believe God doesn't forget the ones who are left in the dark, and sometimes the very floor they left you on becomes the ground you build your comeback from. If these father stories remind you of someone who sacrificed everything and asked for nothing in return, then this one is for them. Because a dad's revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it's perfectly silent, and all the more devastating for it. Here is what I hope you carry away from Eugene's story. Protect what you build. A signature under pressure is not consent. Get the right people in your corner before a crisis, not after. Silence is not weakness. When someone is working against you, gathering proof quietly is almost always more powerful than confronting them in the moment. Do not confuse access with ownership. The people living in your house, spending your money, wearing your name, none of that makes it theirs. And finally, trust takes a lifetime to earn and a single locked door to destroy. Never forget who left you in the dark. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me what you took from it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't yet subscribed to his Hidden Revenge, there are more stories here waiting for you, and every single one of them matters. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.